The rain came down in sheets over the forward operating base, turning the dusty ground into a thick orange mud that splashed against the ankles of every soldier making their way to the mess hall. Sergeant Marcus Thorne watched them from the dry cover of the barracks porch, a mug of lukewarm coffee cradled in his hands. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and solid, a veteran of 3 tours who wore his experience like a second skin. His eyes, however, weren't on the rain. They were fixed on a solitary figure jogging along the perimeter of the base, a small, determined form cutting through the murk. Private First Class Sarah Jenkins. To Marcus, she was an anomaly, a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture of a frontline soldier. She was slight, with a runner's lean frame, and a face that looked far too young to be carrying a rifle in a combat zone. But what truly baffled him, and had become a source of quiet, simmering irritation, was her consistent absence from the mandatory unit physical training sessions. Every morning at 0500 hours, while the rest of the platoon grunted through push-ups and ran wind sprints in the desert heat, Sarah was nowhere to be found. She had a permanent chit from the medic, they said. A bad knee. Weak ankles. The reasons varied with the rumor. Marcus, a man who believed that discipline was the only thing standing between a soldier and a bullet, saw it as a lack of commitment. To him, the unit was a chain, and every link had to be equally strong. A weak link, a soldier who couldn't pull their own weight, endangered everyone. He'd seen it happen, and he'd lost friends because someone wasn't fast enough, strong enough, or mentally tough enough when it mattered. So every morning when he saw her empty space in the formation, a small knot of resentment tightened in his chest. This morning, watching her run alone in the rain, that resentment found a voice. He nudged Specialist Dave Miller, who was leaning against the railing next to him, trying to light a cigarette in the damp air. "Look at her," Marcus said, his voice low and gruff. "Pissing and moaning about a bad knee so she can't do a few push-ups with the rest of us, but she can go for a 5-mile run by herself whenever she feels like it. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?" Miller, a younger man who had learned to just nod along with the senior NCOs, squinted through the rain. "Maybe it's a different kind of PT, Sergeant. A physical therapy or something." "Therapy?" Marcus scoffed, the word bitter on his tongue. "The only therapy she needs is to learn what it means to be part of a team. She's always off by herself, keeps to her bunk, reads those thick books, writes in that journal of hers. Doesn't joke around, doesn't go to the smoke pit. She's not a soldier, Miller. She's a ghost who happens to wear the uniform." He watched as Sarah's form grew larger, then began to slow. She was heading back towards the barracks, her breaths coming in visible puffs of white in the cool morning air. As she got closer, Marcus could see she was drenched, her dark hair plastered to her scalp, her regulation t-shirt clinging to her frame. She was also moving with a slight stiffness, a hitch in her stride that was almost imperceptible, but definitely there, and she was favoring her left side. "Hey, Jenkins!" Marcus called out, his voice sharp enough to cut through the rain. He didn't wait for her to reach the porch. He stepped out into the downpour, not caring that he was getting wet. He wanted to meet her on her level, in her space. Sarah stopped, her chest heaving slightly. She looked up at him, her expression guarded, but her eyes calm. They were a startling shade of gray, clear and direct. "Sergeant Thorne." "That's a hell of a run you just did," he said, his tone conversational but laced with a pointed edge. "Looked like about 5, maybe 6 miles. Solid pace, too, especially in this soup." Sarah just nodded, a single tight motion. "Yes, Sergeant." "So, here's what I don't get." Marcus moved a step closer, looming over her. The rain dripped from the brim of his patrol cap. Every morning, 0500, the entire platoon is out there, sweating and bleeding together, building cohesion, building trust, and you're not there. You've got a profile, they tell me, a bad wheel. But this, he gestured at her, at the run she'd just completed. This doesn't look like a broken soldier to me. This looks like a soldier who thinks the rules don't apply to her. He saw a flicker of something in her gray eyes. Not fear, not anger, but a deep, profound weariness. It was a look he'd seen before, in the eyes of men who had carried a heavy pack for too long. The PT we do is Unit PT, Jenkins, he pressed on, his voice rising slightly. It's about more than just physical fitness. It's about being together, suffering together. You skipping it? It sends a message. It tells the men and women in your squad that you think you're better than them, that you don't need them. And out here, that kind of thinking gets people killed. He paused, letting his words sink in. The only sound was the relentless drumming of the rain on the hard-packed earth and the metal roofs of the Conex boxes. So I'll ask you plain, what's so special about your run that it's more important than being a part of this unit? Sarah stood perfectly still, the rain tracing paths down her face. She didn't flinch under his gaze. She simply looked at him. And in that look, Marcus saw that same weariness, now tinged with a flicker of something else. A decision being made. She reached up with her right hand, her movements slow and deliberate. She unfastened the single large button at the collar of her Army-issue windbreaker. Then, with a practiced ease, she unzipped it halfway down. The rain immediately began to soak the thin gray t-shirt she wore underneath, but Marcus wasn't looking at the shirt. He was looking at what the open jacket revealed. Just below her left collarbone, the fabric of her t-shirt wasn't flat. It was gathered and puckered around a significant, irregular lump. It looked wrong, like something was underneath it that shouldn't be there. A strange, cold feeling, entirely separate from the rain, began to creep up Marcus's spine. Sarah's fingers, steady as a surgeon's, went to the hem of her wet t-shirt. She didn't pull it up dramatically. She simply lifted the damp fabric a few inches, just enough to expose the area beneath her collarbone. And Marcus Thorne, who had seen more than his share of horrors in his 3 tours, had felt the blood drain from his face. It wasn't a lump. It was a crater. A massive, angry purple and red scar dominated the space where smooth skin should have been. It was a chaotic terrain of puckered tissue and grafted skin, a violent starburst pattern that radiated out from a central point. It looked like someone had taken a jagged chunk out of her, right where her shoulder met her torso. The edges were uneven, the skin shiny and tight. It was a wound that spoke of catastrophic force, of shrapnel, of something that should have been fatal. Sarah held the shirt up for only a few seconds, long enough for the image to sear itself onto Marcus's retinas. Then, she let it drop. She re-zipped her jacket with the same calm, deliberate movements, buttoned it at the collar and pulled the hood up over her head, sheltering herself from the rain she had just been running through. She looked at Marcus, her gray eyes holding his stunned blue ones. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The silence was more powerful than any shouted explanation. She simply turned, her gait still bearing that slight hitch, and walked past him towards the barracks door, leaving him standing alone in the deluge, the cold rain finally beginning to seep through his own uniform and chill him to the bone. The heavy metal door of the barracks slammed shut behind Sarah Jenkins, the sound echoing in the sudden, profound silence that seemed to have swallowed Marcus whole. He stood rooted to the spot, the rain plastering his clothes to his body. But he felt none of it. His mind was a blank screen, except for that single horrifying image burned into it. The raw, the lunar landscape of scar tissue where a young woman's healthy body should have been. He had asked for an explanation. He had demanded to know why she thought she was above the rules. And she had given him one, not with words, but with a truth so stark and violent it had stolen the breath from his lungs. The special run, the solitary PT, the permanent chit. It wasn't about privilege. It was about survival. It was about a body relearning how to function after being torn apart. Slowly, mechanically, Marcus walked back to the porch. He set his now cold coffee mug down on the railing, his hand trembling slightly. Miller was gone, probably having ducked inside when the conversation got intense. He was alone. He looked out at the rain, but he didn't see the FOB. He saw the scar. The pattern of it was unmistakable to someone who had spent years in a war zone. That wasn't a cut from a knife or a scrape from a fall. That was a blast injury, high velocity, close proximity, the kind that ripped through concrete and flesh with equal ease. A wave of nausea washed over him, followed immediately by a hot, corrosive wave of shame. He had judged her. He had dismissed her as lazy, as a shirker, as a weak link. He had used her as a symbol of everything wrong with the new generation of soldiers, all while she was carrying a burden he couldn't even begin to fathom. He had mocked her silence, her solitude, never once considering that it might be a shield, a way to protect herself from questions, just like the ones he had just asked. He needed to know. He had to understand. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. And it was about atonement. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The barracks smelled of damp wool, floor wax, and the faint, ever-present scent of diesel. He knew which room was hers. He'd made it his business to know where every soldier in his charge slept. He walked to her door, number 214, and knocked, a soft, tentative rap that was completely unlike his usual commanding pound. The door opened a crack. Sarah's face appeared in the gap. Her expression wasn't hostile, but it was wary, guarded. The gray eyes that had held his so steadily outside were now shadowed. "Jenkins," Marcus started, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat. I need to apologize. That was out of line. I had no right. I didn't know." She studied him for a long moment as if assessing his sincerity. Then without a word, she pulled the door open wider and stepped back, a silent invitation to enter. The room was small and Spartan, standard issue, a metal bunk bed, a wall locker, a small desk bolted to the wall. But there were touches that made it hers. A small pile of well-worn paperback books on the desk. A single photograph stuck to the wall above her bunk with a piece of tape. A much older couple, smiling in front of a small, neat house. And on the small shelf by her pillow, a purple heart medal in its case, lying face up. Marcus's eyes snagged on the medal, a physical confirmation of the story the scar had told. He looked away quickly, feeling like an intruder on something private and sacred. Sarah sat down on the edge of her bunk, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She gestured to the small plastic chair at the desk. Marcus sat, feeling oversized and clumsy. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said quietly. "It's none of my business. I wanted you to know that what I said out there was stupid and ignorant. And I'm sorry." Sarah looked at him, and for the first time, a tiny crack appeared in her stoic facade. It wasn't a smile, but a softening around her eyes. "You were being a sergeant," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You saw someone not pulling their weight. It's your job to ask why." He shook his head. "Not like that. Not with assumptions." A long silence settled between them, filled only by the distant hum of the base's generators and the persistent drum of rain on the roof. Marcus wasn't sure if he should leave. He felt he had done what he came to do, but he also felt rooted to the spot, compelled by a force stronger than protocol. Sarah broke the silence. "It was 18 months ago," she began, her voice so low he had to lean forward to hear. "My first deployment. We were on a dismounted patrol in a village outside Baghdad. Routine stuff, or so we thought. Clearing houses, talking to locals. I was the newbie, the one they kept in the middle of the pack." She spoke without emotion, as if reciting a field report. "We were walking down this narrow alley, mud walls on either side, high enough to block the sun. Kids had been following us, begging for candy, but they'd scattered a few minutes before. That should have been a warning." She paused, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. "I never heard the blast. One second I was walking, watching my feet on the uneven ground, and the next I was on my back, staring up at this impossibly blue sky. There was no sound, just a high-pitched ringing like a million mosquitoes in my ears. And I couldn't breathe." Marcus sat perfectly still, not daring to move, barely daring to breathe himself. He had heard hundreds of stories like this, had been in similar situations himself. But hearing it from her, in this quiet, stripped-down room, it felt different. It felt raw. "My team leader, Sergeant First Class Matt Gable," she continued, her voice catching almost imperceptibly on the name. "He was 3 feet in front of me. The IED was buried in the wall. It was packed with ball bearings, nails, anything that would tear through flesh. The blast caught him full on. It shredded him." Her hands tightened in her lap, the knuckles going white. "I was on his 6. I got the overspray. The shrapnel that missed him." She finally looked at Marcus, and the gray eyes were glistening, but no tears fell. "They tell me I tried to get to him, that I tried to crawl, even with a chunk of my shoulder and collarbone missing. I don't remember that. I just remember the sky and the ringing, and then a medic, whose name I never learned, kneeling over me, his face white with dust and fear, pressing a massive field dressing into my chest so hard I thought he was trying to push me into the ground." Marcus understood now. The hitch in her stride, the way she favored her left side. The scar wasn't just on her chest. The blast wave, the fall, the debris. It would have damaged everything. Ligaments, muscles, nerves. The bad knee was probably a shattered kneecap that had been surgically rebuilt. The weak ankle was likely held together with metal plates and pins. "Matt Gable died," she said simply. He left behind a wife and a 2-year-old daughter. I spent 8 months in hospitals, 3 major surgeries, skin grafts, physical therapy so painful I would throw up afterwards." She looked down at her hands. "They wanted to medically discharge me, give me a desk job or a full disability. But I couldn't. I couldn't let that be the end of my story. I couldn't let Matt's death just be something that ended my career. So I fought. I fought the doctors, the boards, everyone. I proved I could still shoot. I proved I could still pass the minimum standards. I proved I could still be a soldier." She gestured vaguely at her body. "But I can't do the group runs, the high-impact stuff. My joints are held together with hardware and scar tissue. If I try to do formation runs on packed earth, the impact, it sets me back weeks. The solitary runs, on the softer ground by the perimeter, at my own pace. That's my physical therapy. That's how I keep the metal in my body from grinding me to a halt." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and complete. Marcus felt the full, crushing weight of his earlier arrogance. He had seen a ghost, and he had demanded to know why she wouldn't join the living. He hadn't realized she was fighting every single day, alone, just to remain in the land of the living at all. He sat forward, his forearms resting on his knees, his head bowed. He didn't trust himself to speak for a long moment. When he finally looked up, His own eyes were bright with a sheen of moisture that had nothing to do with the rain. "Private Jenkins," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I have been a soldier for 15 years. I have served with brave men and women. I have seen incredible acts of courage, but I have never, ever been more wrong about someone in my entire life." He took a ragged breath. "You are the strongest person in this unit. You are the strongest person I have ever met." For the first time since he'd known her, a small, genuine smile touched Sarah Jenkins's lips. It was a fleeting thing, fragile, but it was there. "Thank you, Sergeant," she whispered. The news of what happened spread through the platoon like wildfire, but not as a piece of gossip. It traveled as a quiet, profound shift in perception. Marcus, in his own way, became the keeper of Sarah's story. He didn't tell anyone the details. That was her story to tell, or not tell. But he subtly corrected the narrative. When someone muttered about her missing PT, he would simply say, "See, she does her PT, just a different kind." And the tone of his voice brooked no further questions. The change in him was noticeable. The hard, judgmental edge that had always been a part of his leadership style softened. He still demanded excellence, still ran a tight ship. But there was a new layer of patience, a new willingness to look beneath the surface. He started paying closer attention to all his soldiers, not just for signs of weakness, but for the hidden strengths they might be carrying, the silent battles they might be fighting. A few days after their conversation in her room, Marcus found Sarah by the motor pool, running a diagnostic on a Humvee's comms system. She was a natural with electronics, he'd learned, calm and methodical. He approached her, this time without the heavy footfalls of an NCO on a mission. "At Jenkins," he said. She looked up, a smudge of grease on her cheek. "Sergeant." "I've been thinking," he began, leaning against the vehicle, "about what you said, about Sergeant Gable, about proving you could still be a soldier." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Proving it to yourself is one thing, but a unit is a family, and in a family you don't have to carry everything alone." She watched him, her gray eyes questioning. "I know you run alone because you have to," he continued. "But the rest of the time, the meals, the downtime, the stupid jokes in the chow hall, that's part of being a soldier too. And you've been sitting those out." Sarah looked down at the greasy rag in her hands. "It's easier," she admitted quietly. "People look at you differently when they know. They walk on eggshells, or they look at you with pity. I can't stand the pity." "No one's going to pity you," Marcus said firmly. "Not after what I saw, but you might be surprised. A lot of these kids, they're scared. It's their first tour. They see you, this quiet, tough-as-nails private, and they don't know what to make of you. They're not avoiding you because they don't like you. They just don't know how to approach you." He pushed off from the Humvee. "There's a group of them heading to the DFAC for dinner in an hour. Miller, Corporal Hayes, a couple of others from 3rd Squad. I'll be there. Why don't you come? No talk about PT, no talk about injuries. Just eat some terrible food and listen to Miller complain about his girlfriend back home." For a long moment, Sarah just stared at him. Then, slowly, that small, genuine smile returned. "Okay." "A sergeant," she said. "I'll be there." The dining facility, or DFAC, was the usual chaotic mix of clattering trays, loud conversation, and the indefinable smell of steamed vegetables and reconstituted meat. Sarah walked in, tray in hand, feeling the familiar pang of self-consciousness. She spotted Marcus's broad back at a long table in the corner. He was laughing at something Miller was saying. As she approached, the conversation didn't stop, but a few of the younger soldiers looked up, their expressions curious but open. "Jenkins!" Marcus boomed, waving her over. "Saved you a spot. Sit. Miller was just telling us about how his girlfriend's new dog apparently hates him more than her ex-boyfriend did." Miller groaned as the others laughed. Sarah slid into the empty seat, placing her tray on the table. For a few minutes, she just listened, a spectator to the easy camaraderie. Then, during a lull, Miller turned to her. "So, Jenkins, Marcus here says you're some kind of comms wizard. We had a problem with the radio in our truck yesterday, kept cutting out. Any ideas?" It was a simple question, a technical one, devoid of pity or awkwardness. It was a question about her skill, her competence. Sarah felt a knot in her chest loosen, just a little. She started to explain what the problem might be, and soon she was engaged in a conversation, not as the wounded soldier, not as the loner, but as Private Jenkins, the unit's comms expert. Over the following weeks, the transformation was subtle but real. Sarah began to emerge from her self-imposed isolation. She still did her solitary runs in the early morning, but she started joining the others for meals more often. She was quiet, but she was present. She even started joining the small group that played cards in the common room on Friday nights, her presence initially causing a slight hush, but soon becoming as normal as Miller's terrible poker face. One evening, a few weeks before they were scheduled to rotate out, Marcus found Sarah sitting alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. He sat down next to her, not saying anything, just sharing the view. "I wrote to Sergeant Gable's wife," Sarah said suddenly, her voice soft. "A few days ago. I told her about the men and women here. I told her that her husband's death, it didn't just save me physically. It changed me. It made me fight to be better. I don't know if that helps her." "I hope it does." Marcus looked at her profile, illuminated by the last light of the day. He saw the same quiet strength, the same depth in her gray eyes, but he also saw something else, a little less weariness, a little more peace. "It will," he said, and he meant it. "Knowing that the person you love didn't die for nothing, it's the only thing that can ever make it bearable." They sat in silence for a while longer, two soldiers watching the night descend on a foreign land. The bugle call for evening colors sounded from the base's PA system, thin and reedy in the vast open space. They both stood automatically facing the flagpole in the distance, though the flag had already been lowered. As the last notes faded, Sarah turned to Marcus. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said. "For what?" "For seeing me," she said simply. "Not the scar. Not the story. Just me." Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in his throat. He watched her walk back inside, her gait still bearing that faint, permanent hitch. But to him, it no longer looked like a limp. It looked like the mark of a warrior, a visible reminder of a battle fought and won, a battle that continued to be fought every single day. He had laughed at her for skipping physical training. He had questioned her commitment, her value to the unit. But she had taught him the most valuable lesson of his entire career, that the strongest chains are not made of identical links, but of links that have been forged in different fires, tested in different ways, and have emerged, unbroken, to hold the line. And Sarah Jenkins, he knew with absolute certainty, was the strongest link of them all.